Good evening, ladies, gentlemen, fellow members of the Clyde River Steamer Club. It's a great, I always think this is one of the highlight evenings, the members' presentations. The only time it wasn't was one time when I gave the presentation, and it was all rather unfortunate, but there we were. We have three great speakers for you this evening. We've got Allan Comrie, James Fisher and Gordon McNeil, who are going to be presenting. I'll let them tell you what they're going to present, but I know you're going to enjoy it. I've got a name check. Can I ask us all to welcome for the first meeting, Brian Shaw. He's been a member for a while. You fair chose your night to come out for your first night. My goodness gracious me. It's a bit cold out there. You should have been in here with Ian Quinn earlier on, because it was as cold out in here as it was out there. We managed to get the heating put on, which I thought was a major move on our part. Sea management, sea hotel, sea me, it's magnificent. Anyhow, moving on. Couple of announcements I want to make. First of all, our next meeting, Clyde River Steamer Club meeting, is on the 11th of January, when Gavin Stewart will be making the presentation. Gavin will be known to many of you. He's a great chap, good fellow, and I'm really looking forward to his presentation. That's the 11th of January. We have a nominated excursion on the 14th of January at 9:45, our Drawson over to Brodick. Probably coming back on the 13:50 back, which gives you a little bit of shore time in Brodick, although you can, if you wish, come back on the 16:40. Both sailings will be on the Isle of Arran. And unfortunately, Heb Isles is kind of like lies fallow, I think might be the word.
Maybe the other way about.
It might be the other way about, but anyhow, so if you want to wait, I think that sailing is guaranteeing two ships. It's at what's 18 something.
No, 16:40.
No, it's
No.
If you want to get two ships, you have to cross in the 9:45 or the 12:30. Come back at 6 o'clock.
No, 6 o'clock. So it'll be dark anyway. And good luck if you want to do that. So that's that. I also, just because it's going to be really interesting, the CCA on the 2nd of February have a conversation, oblique interview with Paul Semple, which I think might be interesting. It's at the Partick the Free Church at Partick. Just revealing a background of running a paddler. That should be an interesting talk as well. So that's the 11th of January, the 14th of January, 2nd of February. We've introduced Brian. Without further ado then, let me introduce you to Allan Comrie, who's going to be giving the first of our members' presentations this evening. Allan, over to you.
Thank you, Robin. At first, when I was asked to do this, I was both pleased and terribly anxious, because the topic I chose was my family and our family going to the Clyde. And this could, I fear, when I decided I was going to do this, could result in a whole lot of tedious family snaps of various steamer excursions I have done throughout my life. And in fact, I was so worried about it, it kept me awake some nights until I realised, well, I've committed myself now, so that's the way it is. I may as well start at the beginning. The picture on the left is myself in Millport, aged about 6 months, having been taken there by my family. My mother was born in Millport, and all summer holidays were spent in Millport. The other photograph is my earliest recollection of life. Obviously, I didn't take it at that point, but when I was about 3 or 2, I turned round in Weems Bay and noted my mother, my father, my sister, a pram, and a pram. The pram had the suitcase in it, which was probably much to my father's. My father probably was very happy about that, because it meant he didn't have to carry it. Holidays, as I say, were spent in Millport, and I think this is a Fraser McHaffey picture of Talisman at the Millport berth. It will always be the Millport berth, despite the fact that it's now no longer the Millport berth. And we always went on Talisman from Weems Bay. This is a Christmas card, believe it or not. This is a Christmas card of probably the vessel that I remember most from those days as a wee boy, of Talisman in Millport Bay. This was this is a photograph, the copyright of which belongs to the Cathedral of the Isles. But it was a Christmas card that they, I must be about 30-year-old, this Christmas card, and I've still got one left. It kind of tells you how many Christmas cards I send. But in that respect, this is Talisman arriving early in the morning at very low tide, and this must have been between 66 and 67 or whatever. So that's the way I remember my summer holidays. They were always punctuated by every morning that we would go round to Keppel Pier and watch the Duchess come in. This is a Margaret Ski picture of the Duchess of Hamilton at Keppel Pier. My father, who always liked walking the hills, would make us walk over the hill and drop down to the pier, down sort of rather dodgy cliffs for children to be done, but nonetheless, that was the way he did it. And I was always quite in awe of the Hamilton and indeed the Duchesses, because they were always big and fast and sleek, and maybe different to the smaller vessels, particularly Ashton, Leven, and the likes that served Millport in those days. Now, I did promise I wasn't going to bore you with family snaps, but these are family snaps that I think have got steamers in them, which makes them perhaps a bit more interesting. Myself and my sister, in the top left, and my mother, and a bit of my grandmother, and a bit of a maid as well, on Talisman. I'm much taken still to this day of sitting on the steps of the paddle box. It's what I do. And I wonder if this has sort of been bred into me from a very young age. We also have below that my sister and myself on the car ferry Bute at Dunoon with Caledonia in the background. The larger picture is strange because from my point of view it's far more interesting for Caledonia going into the pier. But it is my grandmother, my great-grandmother, my late mother, my sister and myself lounging about. I'm sure that they hadn't been drinking, but it just looks that way, you know. It's like, so in that regard, you know, it was we used to spend most Sundays going across to Arran when we were on holiday in Millport, and a few more. And I'm sorry, I apologise, but we have Bute. We have a photograph that my sister found when my mother passed away. We found the photograph, the top right one, and all it said in the back of it was "Maid of Cumbria, May Weekend, 1966." So I understand it was taken by a student of my father's, because in those days, sadly, and perhaps inevitably, our camera, I think, it was always a rumour that I had broken it, but I don't think I had. But we have very few photographs from that time that are usable, and I think it's a great pity. The other ones is Duchess of Montrose going round at Ailsa Craig, and Maid of the Loch. And the nice thing about Maid of the Loch is that perhaps that photograph may be repeated in future years, particularly now that the steps up to the upper deck are reinstated. So these are the type of memories we have from my childhood. However, a very sad thing happened in the mid to late 60s when my family decided, I certainly didn't, that our summer holidays wouldn't be spent on the Clyde. We were sadly sent to St Andrews. Now, don't get me wrong, St Andrews, lovely place, fantastic, beautiful place, no hills, but more importantly, no steamers. And from that point of view, my trips on the Clyde became more sporadic. But I do remember vividly one day when I had pestered my father one Sunday. He was wanting to go out a hill walk. He was a great hill walker. And I pestered him to take me down to Rothesay. And eventually he relented. And he relented such that it's a day that probably reinforced and probably cemented my love of the Clyde. We travelled down to Craigandorn by train, and the two vessels that were sitting at the pier was a Maid and Caledonia. Now this is a photograph, I think, taken by Richard Cotton. It's in the River Steamer Club collection. It actually shows Waverley at the pier, but Waverley wasn't there. She was away doing her Millport Tinnabrewick sale. And it was a glorious day, and we had the most fantastic day. And even my father at the end of it said to me, he said, "The Clyde is marvellous." And I thought to myself, you were going to go to a hill walk. I did that. It was me. So even as a 9-year-old child, I was obnoxious. So in that regard, we had a fantastic time, We took the bus on the West Road down to Kilcatton Bay, and we came back. And at night, we were presented with this. Now, this is a John Goss picture through the River Steamer Club. And it exactly replicates my memory of that day. Exactly. Glorious setting sunshine, the Duchess in at berth 3, and the hapless people waiting at berth 1 for Waverley and Craigendorn. And we waited and waited and waited, and the Duchess left and she went across to Weems Bay. And Waverley eventually arrived. And another memory of that day was, as we left Rothsay Bay, the Duchess left Weems Bay, and we were both heading for Dunoon. And Waverley had quite a considerable head start. But I have never seen a Clyde steamer move quicker than Duchess of Hamilton on that day. It absolutely flew past us. It got into Dunoon, tied up. We got into Dunoon, it left, and by the time we got to Gourock, Duchess of Hamilton was safely tied up at the wires, as if nothing had happened. It was a day that, as I said, cemented my love of the Clyde. Now, to bring me back to my parents, and I've tried to incorporate as many steamers in these photographs as I possibly can. My mother, as I said, was born in Millport, so I think she was at the Garden Festival, so we've got a picture of her with the last Millport passenger ferry. My father, he always used to we always used to have compromises that if I went up a hill, he would go somewhere that we needed to go by steamer. So if we were going to Arran, for example, I would get a trip in a boat. Unfortunately, the boats there are Glen Sannox and the Arran car ferry of choice, Isle of Arran. He also later in life, much like the sails to Tinnabrewick that the Streakers did, and on one occasion, well, more than one occasion, I joined them, and there we are, looking rather glaikit, but never mind, rather nice on the car deck. And then we also did go to the Western Isles, and that's my father watching Columba coming into call. And on another occasion, we were walking the West Highland Way, and we did note that Maid of the Loch was sailing below, so I managed to not quite persuade my father to fall down a cliff, but to stand on the cliff edge and watch Maid of the Loch sail past. So we had, we were managing to satisfy both our interests, although frankly, my hill climbing or hill walking was pitiful compared to his. Now, we then accelerate through life. And the reason Saturn's here is that when you're in your teens and in your early 20s, you start becoming interested in, shall we say, other things other than boats. And Saturn has a particular resonance with myself and my wife because, sadly, on one of our first days out, and this sounds appalling, but I said to her, and it was a November day, I said, "Would you like to go to Rothsay?" And so we went in Saturn. And this is why Saturn has a particular resonance with us. And a few photographs of Saturn. Interestingly enough, the one in the bottom left is Saturn. I think it was taken from Sound of Steel. And my father was actually in Saturn that day, and we didn't know. So it was like quite strange things. And the last one is of her leaving for the last time before going up to Orkney, and now, thankfully, she has found a rebirth in Greece. Saturn, of course, then became, I suppose, redundant. This is her in her last, one of her last sailings. This was the Rothsay Highland Games, when she was filling in on a passenger-only basis with the paddler in the background. But Saturn always has a particular place in my heart, considering the family connection. Another thing that I should add at this time is peculiarity is that my wife couldn't, most Sundays we would go cycling round Comrie. And Margaret was a very keen cyclist. I wasn't so keen in those days, but we would go cycling round Comrie. But what Margaret could never quite understand in those days is, why did we always have to get Loch Linnhe? And you know, it's an idiosyncrasy, but I've always liked Loch Linnhe, more so than the other three, for no apparent reason. And on this occasion, I managed to get the two of them at Cumbria Slip. And as you can see, Loch Linnhe had broken down. And in actual fact, Loch Striven was bringing over a spare part. And the two of them then left exactly at the same time in parallel, carrying hundreds of people and as many cars as they could possibly squeeze on. But Margaret could never understand why we had to get Loch Linnhe. But she learned, you know, that it was just, as I say, an eccentricity. And here's a picture that, this is actually my wife Margaret in swimming in Loch Lomond, when we used to, on nicer days, we used to go out after work or on at weekends. And this is her swimming in Loch Lomond. And it just so happened that the Countess was in the background. That was purely fortuitous, I can assure you, or maybe not. So in that regard, you know, we've always had this thing. Now, after a while, of course, children come along. The two of them at the back came along, and they were, I wouldn't say quite forced, but they were encouraged to come with us down the coast. And in actual fact, the photograph at the top left, I was actually sent out by my work to take photographs of various modes. And this was Ailsa at McEnroy's Point. I can't remember which one it was. What one was it, John? Sander. Sander Sand in the background. I'd actually been sent to it. So, of course, the work had found it quite amusing when, in those days, you had to develop the film, and of course, it was the works film. They couldn't quite understand why they got a slide back of my daughter. But nonetheless, that's neither here nor there. Also, Ailsa, I would take Ailsa, and this is a day we took down with our granny and grandpa down to Rothesay. And as you can see, this photograph was taken purely and simply for Ailsa in her pram, and not for Juno at all. And similarly, again, a one of her at Rothesay on Saturn. The bottom one is the two of them. Ailsa looks less than enthusiastic about being on call, going across to I think it was called. Was it called, John? Rathlin? Was it Cana? It's Cana. We were in Cana going across to Rathlin Island. So, but nonetheless, it was them, and that's what they were taking on. Now, subsequently along came Andrew, and this is Andrew on his first ever sail on a Clyde boat. This is Andrew on Juno. Inevitably, it had to be a streaker for many reasons, and we were going across to Dunoon. And as I recall that day, the one good thing I did find about the Clyde was that the surfeit of fresh air made Andrew sleep most of the day, which actually made it a very good day, as I recall. And I remember walking around the Younger Memorial Gardens, not a peep, not a peep. It was great. But nonetheless, Andrew's first ship was Juno. And there we see a group of, obviously, very discerning ferry watchers standing on Reams Bay Pier with the charismatic pioneer, quite my favourite Clyde, or in Calmac car ferry. She was, to my mind, wonderful. My children and my wife are there as well, but pioneers in the background, so that's quite a wee bonus. And then we come to holidays that were spent on Bute. And it meant that it was quite good because you could get any number of photographs. And here's a rather, some would say, oblivious child, doesn't realise that, almost like the shark in Jaws, Juno is sneaking up behind them. And I think there's an air of menace about Juno in that, and I quite like it. It's quite kind of its time. And that was Andrew. Of course, you wouldn't be allowed to sit anywhere near the edge of the pier now, you know, it's like, oh my God, you know. So maybe it's just a bad example of or a good example of very bad parenting. The kids used to come with us. They came a lot, but as you can see, most of the photographs are punctuated by car ferries in the background. And holidays, as I say, were spent in Rothesay. Not the greatest photograph at the bottom, but it shows Jupiter and Pioneer in Rothesay Bay, which were quite the favourite combination, certainly for me. And then Andrew became, Ailsa was growing up and became more interested in, shall we say, proper things, like, you know, not coming down the coast on wet and miserable days with her brother and father. And so Andrew became, you know, much enamoured by the vessels, partly because he had very little choice. And we have a photograph there, particularly the one on the left of I wouldn't want to say this in his company, but an old purser and a newer purser. Because in the background, Walter is we're quite friendly with Walter. We live quite near to him. So Walter's been a great encourager of Andrew's interest in the steamers. The top right hand one is might as well Andrew's brush with greatness. Might as well, you know, he was a bit too young to remember Pioneer, but I took him down to James Watt Dock when Pioneer was in the process of being sent to Africa, and I thought it might as well make Andrew aware that he was in the company of greatness, and that wasn't me, that was the vessel. And on Butte's first day, we were down at Rothesay, and Andrew managed to get in the way. We also went on wee trips. Arran was a particular favourite. Arran by any other vessel, shall we say. And this is Andrew and I think we were going across for a wee cycle round Brodick. Not very far, but we did go, and Saturn waiting our turn at the Irish berth. And now comes a few photographs of, shall we say, his first love. And it transpired that Andrew and I started going on trips because Ailsa and her mother were more interested in doing nice things and things that normal people would do. And you'll notice in this picture, the weather is rotten. And what used to happen on most Saturdays or Sundays, if there was a rotten day, I would turn around and say to Andrew, do you want to go to Dunoon? Which in actual fact was coded, do you want to go in Jupiter? So he would say yes, and that's why inevitably most of the photographs are a bit rubbish, because it was always raining. But this is him. He doesn't look very happy, but he was actually ecstatic. He was on his boat. He was, and he'll tell you he was, because this is his boat. And on that particular day, it's not a great picture, but well, I think it is, because I took it, and it sums up the Waverley for me. We were Jupiter hove to, off Curn. The Waverley passed inside her, and then we proceeded. And I've said this many a time, but I often think, who got the better view? Yeah. Did Waverley on Jupiter, Waverley's passenger seeing Jupiter, or Jupiter's passenger seeing Waverley? I think we all know the truthful answer, but I think for me it was, I quite like that photograph of Waverley, but I also like the fact I took it from Jupiter. And Jupiter was our great favourite. We spent hours dotting about Dunoon on Jupiter. She was absolutely, our favourite. And that's sheer self-indulgence. That's my favourite photograph I've taken of Jupiter. It's not particularly well composed. It's not particularly bright or anything like that. It doesn't show the vessel to her best, but I just like it. So that's in for self-indulgence. We got quite well known by the staff on the pier. On one occasion, near the end, we were invited out onto the edge of the pier, which of course nowadays you're not allowed to because of health and safety situation. And we befriended a seagull who was also admiring Jupiter as she left Dunoon. Of course, all good things must come to an end, and Jupiter was laid up and then subsequently taken away and converted into razor blades or whatever it is they did to her. And that was rather a sad day. But one of the touching things about that day was that we were waiting to go across to Dunoon, and one of the pier hands on Gourock Pier came up to us and said, and we didn't particularly know the chap, and he says to us, they're bringing her down this afternoon, because he had recognised that we'd been there so often, and they'd recognised why we were there, and we were there because of Jupiter, but by this time Saturn was on the route, and that was Jupiter being taken away. Very sad. But we also liked other vessels. QE2, we went down to see the QE2, and this is her in Greenock. On the last occasion she called in on the Clyde. And that led to going on some cruises. And we did go on some cruises. Not Clyde cruises, but a couple of Baltic and Mediterranean cruises. But inevitably the Mediterranean cruise had to include Naples, because we had to see Maid of Skelmerley. And indeed, when I got up at 4 o'clock in the morning to stand on the decks of the cruise ship, I was it was magnificent watching the sunrise over Mount Vesuvius. But no, I was rather more interested in seeing Maid of Skelmerley, and that was Maid of Skelmerley in Naples. However, back to reality, and the River Steamer Club cruise from, I think, 2015 or 16, I can't remember. I'm not very good at cataloguing my photographs. And Arran was a great favourite, or is a great favourite. And this was Isle of Arran coming in to collect us to go round Arran on that occasion. And Arran became our January destination of choice, because why wouldn't you go to Arran in January? And particularly in the days when Klansman was on the roster. I remember poor Andrew looking at me bamboozled when I got on Klansman for the first time and said to him, "This is a ship." And he just looked at me as if to say, "That's daft." But he's probably right. But nonetheless, Klansman to Arran became a very popular thing that we did in January. And of course the other vessels as well. The bottom right one, I think, the bottom left one rather, is something that people should perhaps be slightly concerned about. We were lucky enough to be invited onto the bridge of Klansman on one of our sailings down from Barra. And this is Andrew sitting in the masters, or one of the chairs of those what are driving the boat. Fortunately, she was on autopilot, because I shudder to think what our fellow passengers would have thought if he was in charge, particularly going down the Sound of Mull. The other one is Lord of the Isles on, I think, Ardros and Brodick, but I'm not entirely sure. But it was just for interest. And then Andrew, of course, decided that he would take up his own photography. So we've got lots of duplicate photographs. I take a photograph of him, we're taking exactly the same photograph that I'm taking. So in that regard, it's nice that he took up taking photographs, and indeed some of the better photographs are always taken by him, mainly because he nicks my better camera. So in that regard, we've quite a lot of photographs, but quite a lot of them are quite similar. But we still go family trips. Still went family trips. It's just something we do as a family. And variously on Lochton Vegan, I can't quite remember why, it must have been one of our Rothsay holidays. And of course Saturn to Brodick, which, why wouldn't you go to Brodick on Saturn, if only just to avoid the other vessel. However, this is where we come up to date, and Andrew. Back in the day, when he was a wee boy, and as I said earlier on with Walter's sort of encouragement, he used to let Andrew occasionally change the boards, but he wouldn't tell him what to put in where. He would leave it up to Andrew, and of course you have to work iteratively backwards. So he used to let Andrew do that, and you see a picture of Andrew and Ailsa on the left, back in the day, where I think he had assembled the destination, and more recently, where as his professional job was to somewhat easier because there are fewer destinations, but nonetheless, what he does now. And of course, Andrew has been purser on Waverley these last 2 years. He's very proud of his job. He's even more proud of his epaulets, but he's very proud of his job and he enjoys it. And he is, I think, I would like to think that he's gone into it voluntarily, but perhaps he's been kind of forced into it by his parent, who has sort of pushed him in that direction, which makes me somewhat embarrassed. And this is Andrew recently on the bridge down at London, where Waverley fortunately was able to get to after a few years' absence, and Tower Bridge in the background. And that's us, that's the family, on Tinnabruach Pier with the Waverley. Ailsa was crewing that day as a catering assistant, weren't you? Yeah, yes. Andrew with his hat. Now, if he loves his epaulets, he absolutely adores his hat. That's his thing. In actual fact, the only two things I can really honestly say ever since he's got that job is all I have to do is look at the paddle box and all I have to see is a hat. And myself and my wife, Margaret, and that's us on Tinnabruach Pier. I hope this hasn't been too tedious or too repetitive, but it's about the only subject on Clyde steamers that I know that I will know more about it than any of the other members, because you know far more about the vessels generally, so I can only cling to those the knowledge I have of my family. I'd like to thank River Steamer Club. I'd like to thank Andrew Clark for inviting me to make this talk. John Goss, Fraser Mahaffey, Margaret Ski and Richard Cotton, and the club for their photographs. The Cathedral of Isles. I'd like to thank my my late mother and my late father, so they're not in a position to accept my thanks. My sister, who used to come along as well, and she always, in a typical brother-sister way, she always liked a boat that was different from mine. So she preferred Caledonia, whereas I liked Waverley. She preferred, one of the other vessels. She always hated the maids, actually, which I think was appalling. But so we had the sibling rivalry thing even went onto boats, which I think she deserves a bit of credit because that did foster my interest. I'd like to thank Margaret. It's too cold for Margaret to be here tonight, believe you me. But I think her tolerance of me in general, but particularly when it comes to Clyde steamers, is beyond anything that is reasonable. And Ailsa and Andrew, I'd like to thank the two of them for making me a proud, if somewhat shameful father, for having taken them down the coast, and now they both work in the industry, as it were. And I'd like to thank you all, both here and watching virtually, for watching and listening to this presentation tonight. Thank you.
Microphones to be changed. Thank you so much, Alan. That was just lovely. I particularly enjoyed the description of your late grandmother as a bit of a maid. I may have picked that up wrong, but and Andrew and Ailsa, welcome. It's lovely to see you both here. Thank you for coming. Alan, thank you so much. That was really fun. Thank you. And now, welcome James Fisher. James.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I'm in the same category here. I was invited along by Andrew Clark, and my first thought, oh my goodness, what did I do? So first off, an apology to Stuart Craig. I'm going to mangle his on-the-spot interview system and take you basically through our family history by way of Stuart's interrogation. My first steamer memory, Duchess of Hamilton. It was a sail from Lochranza to Campbelltown and back, 1970, so last season in service. And I have very clear memories of that steamer cutting through the water, through the Kilbrannan Sound, just like a knife through butter. Beautiful boat, fell in love with her. Now that's my first memory. The problem is, we had to get to Arden somehow, so I must have been in something else to get there. Fortunately, Mother took a picture. Caledonia. I'm a wee bit annoyed she didn't take a picture of the Erskine Ferry as well, because we used that too. And the Erskine Ferry, the following year when we went to Arden, had gone. We had the Erskine Bridge, which involved a pantomime on the return journey. Duchess of Hamilton, of course, had gone. Caledonia was still there. But instead we had the cowl dotting about, so that substituted. The pantomime on the Erskine Bridge, we had arranged to be collected by my brother at Erskine Bridge. Friends were going to run us up there. Unfortunately, I hadn't arranged which side to meet at. So we duly crossed the bridge, seeing our opposite car going opposite directions, so both parties turned around and crossed the bridge again. At which point we decided this was a little bit daft, so both parties then proceeded to sit at the opposite sides of the bridge for a period until one decided to move, and eventually we met each other, but long before the days of mobile phones. My last steamer journey, well, that's not really it, but it was the Waverley to Aricka, which you've all seen, so I thought, well, we'll do something different. Here's a previous Waverley on a journey from Aricka, but this has relevance to Waverley's trips up there. That is one of the targets for the torpedo range. And the Waverley here is just approaching Glencroe, which was also the point where a ferry crossed from Morlagan Ferry. And there was an old lady who lived in Aricka, which I knew as a very young child. She was a very old lady. But her father had used the Morlagan Ferry to access the steamers, the Chancellor, on his journey from Glasgow to Aricka. He was ferried ashore. Not one I've ever seen written anywhere, but it's almost like the rural bus stops. If you hold your hand out, a bus will stop. Holidays. Well, Dunoon, Rossi, Arden. Well, Arden I've covered. Rossi was always a day trip for us. This is Waverley in 1970. It was a day trip from Gourock we went on. Gourock, Dunoon and Ellen Rossi. It's stamped on my brain. And whilst we were there, this apparition appeared at the pier. Unfortunately, my mother took a photograph of it. All I can remember is noise. But however, the real holiday destination for myself and the family was Lismore. A wee bit before my time, Loughnell, an interesting wee steamer, or boat rather. The only vessel that my mother was ever seasick on. And that's another one from the harbour. By the time I was going to Lismore, she'd been replaced by the Lochtoskig, a converted fishing boat, take your pick. Lismore was a great destination for us. Relatives there, you'll discover we had relatives all through the west coast. And one of the highlights of going to Lismore was to see this several times a week passing. King George V passed up Loch Linnhe on their way to Fort William. And on one glorious occasion, we actually sailed on her from Port Appin to, my memory tells me, Fort William, but looking at the timetables, it must have been Oban. We were taken out in the ferry boat, hoiked aboard the King George V, and then the return journey, you were basically grabbed by two McBrain Burleys and thrown into the ferry boat and back ashore. A great memory. That would be 1974. We did that. Now, I'm very much a dyed-in-the-wool North British man. Went to school in Helensburgh to Hermitage, which was within sight of Craigendorn Pier. The streets round about were all named after North British steamers. The fruit and veg man, his lorries, were all named after North British steamers. I lived in Ardloe, which is on the West Highland Line. Everything was North British. So, my favourite steamer, Mercury. I love her. beautiful boat. The perfect paddle steamer to my mind, if she had a red, white and black funnel, of course. There's just something about the Mercury that I take to much more appealing to me than what the Caledonia. Caledonia always looks a little bit dumpy and stout somehow. The Mercury just is such a lovely arrangement. Now, I'm a sheep farmer to trade, generations of sheep farmers. It's not a natural place for a steamer dreamer to come from. But my mother was a little bit of a steamer dreamer. That's her favourite boat. Jeannie Dean's at Arica. And as a child at Arica, she played on her and her friends would play on the steamers as they lay over. And she always talked about the Juno, the Waverley, and Jeannie Dean's. Until one day, one of them played a harp. There was a harp on board one of the boats, and one of the girls strummed the harp, and they were ejected off the steamer and then were never allowed back on the pier. Father was born in Otter Ferry at Largamore Farm, which is just behind the pier basically, and had used the pier as a passenger, sailed on the Iona from Otter Ferry. And when Waverley went back there in, when was it, 94, 93, 94? 93. My father came with us. It's the only sailing I ever went with him. He sailed back to Otter Ferry that day. A bit of a homecoming. He did have a hidden interest in steamers. He would occasionally utter memories of steamers. But the only steamer he would ever say was any use was a Millard Castle. To him, that was the Clyde steamer. Of course, at Otter Ferry, Millard Castle was today's Twitter, Facebook, WhatsApp, you call it what you will. She brought the news. Even the outbreak of war was announced from the bridge of the Millard Castle. Waverley's best colour scheme, the one that she's never had. I would love to see Waverley in the grey. Again, the Jeannie Deans on Loch Long. However, saying that, nothing can beat the excitement of the 24th of May, 1975. 12-year-old boy and his friends standing in the pier at Doon, camera in hand. Not a very good camera, by the way. But to see the Waverley emerging from behind Gourock and these red, white and black lums was just incredible. It's favourite maid, well, that would be Maid of Skelmerley. An interesting photo of this one. The house in the background is a ferry house at Roon Arrows, which would infer that the maid here was coming out of the Gairloch. Maid of Skelmerley is the only maid I ever sailed on. Again, day trips to Rothesay. It was done twice. But to a Loch Lomond boy, there only is one maid. That one. Maid of the Loch. Part of my life, well, more or less from the day I was born. I was putting pram out in the garden, and the Maid of the Loch would turn in front of the house, and I would ooh and ah at it. This is her at Inversnaid. The small boat in the foreground is the Silver Spray, which was the Inversnaid Hotel boat, which carted the lucky bus parties across the loch. Crewed by one Wally the boatman. It was really quite the ride of death if Willie had a few drinks in him. And it was a blooming sight worse, I can tell you, if he was sober. Because at least when he was drunk, he knew what he was doing. So, that's the Sneyd. That's a more normal view for me of the maid. For 7 years, that was my normal view of a maid, passing Arica Primary School. I hear you say that Arica's in Loch Long. Well, very true. Arica Primary School, however, like railway stations, is 2 miles away and located in Tarbert. And the school playground went right to the foreshore. And the highlight every day was to run down and get your feet wet as the maid passed by. There's the pier at Tarbert. There's the primary school. And there's our playground.
Wow.
Perfect. What a place to have a school. A couple of shots of Tarbert Pier in older days. And it introduces my second love, my sheep. Nice wee bunch of blacky tops. The steamer is the Queen approaching the pier. Must have been a lovely day because you can see the reflections of the steamer. Flat calm, not often the loch was like that. And an older view of the Queen at Tarbert Pier. Late 1880s, early 1890s. Again, it must have been an absolute peach of a day with the amount of parasols you can see on the aft deck. The best point-to-point sailing, well, for me that would always start at Malig. Involved a train journey from Ardloe to Malig. Transfer to steamer. If we were going to cousins in Shieldig, involved the Loch Seaforth to Kyle, a train journey to Strathcarn, car to Shieldig, and then you walk the last bit into Teeslig. So you usually had plenty of time at Kyle to have a wee trip back and forward across to Skye on one of the turntable ferries. However, the B part of A to B would have to be Portree, a journey we did once on the Loch Arkaig. Absolute peach of a day. That's a postcard view. The day we sailed was like that. Unfortunately, it had been very, very hot. The swing bridge at Banavie had opened to allow the Charlotte Dundas through, which took too long in its transit. The bridge had expanded. They couldn't shut it again, and the trains were all off. So we were put on a replacement bus service from Fort William to Malig in the good old days of single track roads, and you don't need fun fares. That journey was immense in itself. So that put the Loch Arkaig late to depart from Malig. We transited up to Kyle, where there was a lot of cargo to go to Raasay, so that made her even later. A lot of cargo to go off at Raasay. Later again, so I think by the time we got to Portree, our uncle in Portree had given up all hope of ever seeing us. It was a tremendous day. Name for a new Clyde steamer. I think we should go back to the birds. Lapwing, Cygnet, my own favourite, Plover. Again, this is another holiday destination of mine, Granny's home, Balmacara. But in naming steamers, what the Clyde really needs now is a Lucy Ashton. Just dependable, reliable, gets the job done, no fuss. Lucy Ashton was part of my life for 5 years. Don't look that old, but as I said, Hermitage Academy. Lucy Ashton's wheel was mounted next to the assembly hall at Hermitage, so every day we went down and paid homage to the Lucy's wheel. Which pier to reopen? Well, leaving aside the obvious Arica, Millport, Helensburgh, the list goes on. There's only one for me. Ardloe, not Arden, Loch Katrine as it says here. This is a little warning to people buying postcards, and never believe a caption. That is most definitely Ardloe, with the Prince Consort. Quite an early photograph because Ardloe Hotel is little more than a lodge house. So it's, I think it's the oldest picture I have of a steamer at Ardloe Pier. A more normal view of Pier, Princess May. And that would be 1930s onwards. An earlier view of the Prince George at the pier. Now, how do you know it's earlier? These trees in the background were harvested in the 20s. So if you're looking at photographs of Ardloe and you want to put a date on it, there's the clue. And whilst we're reopening piers, at the north end of Loch Lomond, where the canal goes into the Fallach, we could do maybe with maybe completing the bridge that was never built. If you've read the history of Loch Lomond steamers, you'll know all about the bridge. Or better still, restore the chain ferry there, which by the time our family moved to Loch Lomond side in 1917, there was not much left other than a chain and a few bits of timber. But that had been used as a means of transit across the loch. Looking to the future, well, hopefully one day we'll see this. Maid of the Loch approaching Ardloe. That's the old family farm in the background, Ardleash. And yes, it would be lovely to see it again. So there's my final slide, but it is a commercial Christmas card provided by Percival Marshall and Company, who were producers of the Model Engineer magazine, Model Railway News. And for some reason they picked an image of Maid of the Loch at Ardloe. Steamer photos can be found in the most unlikely of places. Now, I read in Andrew's article on our founder members about our love of Ferd Lanark Football Club. That is a trait in our family as well. However, I've got a football programme here. Most unlikely place. A Clyde steamer in the back of it. Advertising Clyde Pleasure Steamers, an illustrated history by Ian McCrory. Keep your eyes open, people. Clyde steamers turn up in the most unlikely of places. So that concludes my little jaunt round the family history, the heritage, the steamships. So I'd like to thank you all for bearing with me. And I will now hand over to Gordon.
Thank you so much, James. Again, I'll fill in the 10 seconds, but that was just a marvellous talk, full of history, and I didn't realise you were a sheep farmer. I know many sheep farmers through another interest of mine, and Jim Stirling's, in fact, curling. A lot of farmers curl. And without further ado, go.
Right, thank you very much. As a member of the Steamer Club for 54 years, I think, I've never had the ambition to address the club ever. But Andrew Clark is extremely persuasive, and I met him in the Waverley this year and he persuaded me. After tonight you may begin to realise why I've never been asked before. I'm a complete and utter technophobe. I don't even know what they call these things. So I have to thank him and Robin here and others for the help in getting this off the ground, because otherwise I would be totally unable to do it. I was looking for a title, and I came across a quote from President Theodore Roosevelt. Over 100 years ago, he said, "Unreflected nostalgia can breed monsters." Well, to give you a slight background, I was born and brought up in Kilmarnock in the years just after the Second World War. And my main connection with steamers, therefore, was really at Ayr, and partly at Ardrossan and Largs as well. My grandfather had worked for the GSW Railway, later the LMS. So Craig and Dorn, the NB, the LNER, they were unknown. In fact, they were anathema. I knew nothing of these places at all. But at Ayr, we had the Marchioness of Graham, on which we sailed every year. Oh, sorry. The Marchioness of Graham in Ayr Harbour in 1952, which was her second last season in Ayr. Now, she wasn't very popular at Ayr. because she was compared unfavourably with the pre-war Duchess of Hamilton and even with the old paddler Juno. And the main problem, as I heard it as a child, was her capacity. It was often difficult to get tickets. And it was made worse because Butlin's camp had opened at Ayr and they had block bookings on certain days. My mother, she waxed lyrical about the Duchess of Hamilton. And she had sailed on it in her first two seasons in 1932 and 1933 on season tickets with a friend and her sister. And then once my mother had died, I realised there might have been other reasons for her enthusiasm. This is her in 1932 with one of the sailors on the Duchess of Hamilton. Now that she's dead now, or I would never have shown this. But there are other pictures as well. She seemed very, very keen on the violinist in the band. So the Duchess of Hamilton had been her favourite. And that was the background to my interest really in steamers. It was my grandfather and then my mother later on. I'm going to divide this into three parts. My earliest memories, first of all, my father was a shopkeeper. And so the longest break he would ever take was a week. The furthest he would go on holiday was Largs. If you think of Arkwright and Ronnie Barker, yeah, you've got the picture. The first picture taken of me on a Clyde vessel is the leaving at Millport in the late 40s. And for somebody brought up in Clement Attlee's post-war austerity, I look quite healthy. I've done rather well, it would appear. My mother, I think, took that picture. She would never have allowed any other child to stand on a seat, but she's put me up on that seat, obviously. That's me 74 years later, at Blairmore this year, as the Waverley calls back at the pier. That was the day the Waverley collided with the wall at Greenock Harbour. So these are the parameters, 1948, 2022. I think I actually look better in that picture than I do in the one in 1948, but don't make any comments. My favourite vessel as a child was Duchess of Fife. And by the time I knew her, really she was the last survivor, in 1952 anyway, of James Williamson's pre-1914 fleet. And what a survivor she was. 210 feet of absolute perfection. And every year we would do the afternoon cruise from Largs over to Rothesay, then round by Kilcatton Bay, Millport, and back to Largs. And what I remember most clearly from her is her open bow. She was the only steamer left in the Clyde by that time with this feature. This is Kilcatton Bay. And that is her in her post-war condition with wheelhouse and so on. At Kilcatton Bay, I used to watch the rope handling from the open bow. I was always fascinated by that. And the pier master was always assisted at Kilcatton Bay by a young boy who I assume was his son. Now, earlier this year in Kilcatton Bay, I found a plaque on a lamppost, it was, commemorating the last pier master of Kilcatton Bay, who had died as late as 2003 in his 90s. And I assume it must have been this man whom I remember. I've always, no, it's not just the steamers that have appealed to me. I've always liked to go to the places. So you'll never find me sailing up Loch Fyne from Tarbert. I'd always rather get off at Tarbert to explore Tarbert. I would rather go off at Campbelltown to see Campbelltown than go to the Mull of Kintyre. I like to get off at Blairmore to see Blairmore. The people and the places have always meant an awful lot. And that was the case here at Kilcatton Bay. The other cruise that we always did from Largs was the afternoon cruise to the Arran coast by Queen Mary on the 10 o'clock run from Glasgow. But in 1951, there was a special treat awaiting me. As we stood in Largs Pier, waiting for the steamer to come in, I said, and I must have been an obnoxious child, I think, "That's not the Queen Mary." My father said, "Nonsense, of course it's the Queen Mary." Any two-funnel turbine was like any other two-funnel turbine as far as he was concerned, but it was the King Edward. So I had the privilege of sailing once on the King Edward. And this is a deck shot of King Edward in 1951, her last season. She had swapped rosters that year with the Mary. This is in the Isles of Bute, of course. And we sat somewhere about here, I can remember it quite clearly. My mother moaned about the smoke and the cinders. She seemed to me faster than the Queen Mary. It's probably just an illusion. She seemed sleeker than the Queen Mary, but she wasn't as comfortable. She didn't have the covered accommodation that the Queen Mary had. But the fact was I sailed on what Duckworth and Langmuir called this epoch-making vessel. And it was when I told Andrew Clark that, foolishly, he said, "Oh, you'll have to speak to the steamer club if you've sailed on the Queen Mary." He didn't realise I was quite as old as I actually am. So that was the early years. The next part of my talk is just one particular year, 1952. Now, in 1952, my father pushed the boat out and we went to Rothsay instead of Largs on holiday. My mother claimed we were going to Craigmore because she was kind of posh, but it was actually Rothsay. And it was an appalling week for weather. It rained every day, but what a glorious week it was for me. This was the year before the Maids. There were no car ferries. This was the last year of an almost totally steam-driven fleet. Apart from Talisman, before Ian Quinn shouts at me, apart from Talisman and the smaller ferries like Countess of Breadalbane, which had appeared in the Clyde that year, to stand on Rothsay Pier, as I did every morning, wouldn't be allowed to now. My parents allowed me to stand there and watch these wonderful vessels coming and going. The Duchesses going to what I thought were exotic places I'd never heard of, Inverary or Campbelltown, and the St Columba on the Royal Route to Ardrishig or to Tarbert. I saw the Craigendorn steamers for the first time. I sailed in Waverley for the first time that year. I had never heard of Craigendorn. I had been, in 1950, taken to the Gairloch to see Aquitania, which had been brought up to be broken up at Faslane. That I remember. But the North Bank was a mystery as far as I was concerned. So there we were. A wonderful experience that year. I took that picture with a Brownie box camera in 1958, the last year of the St Columba, as she was leaving Rothsay in the afternoon to return to Gourock. This is the kind of scene you got at Rothsay in that particular year. And also, at the same time, this is 58 as well, this is Talisman arriving at berth 3 in Rothsay, doing what I think would be the Fifesole run. Although by this time she didn't call it Kilcatton Bay on the way back. So these were the kind of steamers I saw for the first time. Think about it. Apart from Glensannox and maybe Marchioness of Graham, I'm not quite sure about that one. On that week, I saw Duchess of Fife, St Columba, Duchess of Montrose, Jeannie Deans, Hamilton, Queen Mary, Caledonia, Talisman, maybe the Graham, Marchioness of Lorne, Jupiter, and what we called the New Waverley. It was a wonderful time, absolutely wonderful. Didn't realise at that point that this was the last year of a totally steam fleet. But also, of course, it was the last full season for Duchess of Fife. And here she is arriving at Rothsay Pier. This picture was taken by Ian's father, Eddie Quinn. And it's a wonderful picture. I'm told this is the bow of the Caledonia. Talisman is leaving, and there is Waverley as well. So 1903, 1934, 35 and 47. And look at that wonderful open bow. When I think of that year, and I think of the three pre-Great War steamers that I do remember, King Edward, St Columba and the Fife, they were all related because King Edward's wife was Queen Alexandra, and that was the original name of St Columba. The Duchess of Fife was his daughter, because Princess Louise, Princess Royal, had married the Duke of Fife in 1889, and the Fife was named in honour of her. The first Queen Alexandra by this time was sailing on the west coast of Canada as Princess Patricia. So Edward's wife had now become his niece, because Princess Patricia, and knowing King Edward's propensities, who knows? Because Princess Patricia was the daughter of his younger brother. Anyway, one of my other things is royal genealogy. Don't get me onto that one. The third part of my presentation is the 1970s. After the 50s, our holidays, we began to go further afield. We found the flesh pots of Southport, Scarborough, Morecambe, Llandudno, Torquay, and even, wonderfully, one year Blackpool, where I found McGill's postcards for the first time. Wonderful things. So our visits to the Clyde were day trips from 1952 really till 1969. But by 1969 it became clear that the writing was on the wall for the steamers. Caledonian was withdrawn at the end of that year. So Stuart Day and I, my friend who would have been here tonight, but Mick Lynch decided otherwise, he and I, throughout the 70s, took a 14-day season on the steamers based in Dunoon. Now, of course, things were becoming more and more restricted, and in 1970, the Hamilton was withdrawn. This is her at Inverary in 1969 on a steamer club charter, actually. So she went at the end of the 70 season, and then the Maids went. Waverley was withdrawn at the end of the 73 season. Here she is at Dunoon Pier, a stump mainmast. This is 1971 because she had the accident at Aracher Pier that year. So she had gone by the end of 1973, and we were left with Queen Mary. And her roster by that time was rather mundane, in fact a bit boring almost. This is her 1971 Lochranza, the 27th of September. That was the last timetabled call at the old pier at Lochranza. She's returning from Campbelltown there. But some of us did persevere right throughout the 70s. And that's Stuart Day at the far left, me. Nigel Coombs, you may recognise from the Bristol Channel, stays in Porter's Head, a great fan of the P&A Campbell paddlers. The elderly gentleman, although he's not as old as I am now, but is Max Smith. I don't know whether anyone remembers him at all, but he sailed every year, and he was a traveller for Nelson's books, and really quite a character. And it's because of him that I have a set of silver sugar tongs from King Edward. And they are inscribed as King Edward. He acquired them for me. I'll come back to that later, but don't tell anybody. So a group of us kept sailing on the Clyde. Nigel used to come up from Bristol every year for this. However, as time went on, things became more and more difficult. Stuart and I had become friendly with Alf Keating, who was the Assistant Chief Steward in Queen Mary. And because of that, helpings were particularly large, and he certainly kept the cost down. And Stuart christened Queen Mary T.S. Meals on Wheels at that point. Alf was ably assisted by Lily Oakman as the head waitress. Her sister Bessie was in Waverley. They both ended up their careers on Maid of the Loch. However, by 1978, Glen Sannox was the cruise vessel, and not all that successful, really. This is her in 78 at Brodick. Stuart and I again. Colin Cowan, anyone remember him? No, he was a regular on the steamers at that time too. However, all was not quite lost, because in 1975, triumphantly, Waverley returned, and this was a most optimistic moment for some of us. This is a picture taken aboard Waverley in 1983. The wonderful Eddie Ross on the right, David MacDonald, they're both gone now, Bobby Butler. They all look quite mad, actually, when you look, and Stuart Day in the background there. The Waverley became a sort of way of life. And one last incident that I would like to recall was in the 15th of July, Friday the 15th of July 1977, St Swithin's Day. We were in Queen Mary, coming through the Kyles of Bute, when the news spread like wildfire, Waverley's on the Gantoks. And as we rounded Tower Point, all the steamer aficionados were up at the bow of the Mary, and binoculars were being passed round from hand to hand, and sure enough, Waverley was on the Gantoks. Well, we were staying in Dunoon that night, and the Waverley by that time, courtesy of our friends at the American base, had been moved to the Coal Pier. And we were joined by the great Geoffrey Grimshaw. We'd become quite friendly with Geoffrey by this time. And as a dog lifted its leg on the keel of the Waverley, Geoffrey turned and said to us, "What a way to end your career as a public urinal." And he chortled merrily at this. Well, Geoffrey was an expert in coastal shipping, we all know that, and many of his prognostications were correct. But I'm glad to say he was totally wrong about the Waverley. And we should all be particularly grateful, I think, that because of her, we can still enjoy the pleasures of the Firth. May that continue for a long time to come. To go back to the silver sugar tongs, Mac Smith had a theory. If he got a good meal on the Queen Mary, he left a good tip. If it was a poor meal, he took a piece of cutlery. Hence the sugar tongs, because he had already taken something else that day. Now, I intended to stop there, but if you could just indulge me for a minute or two. Were there not other two? No?
No.
Is that the last one? Huh. Right. I was going to show two other vessels here. One was the paddle steamer Schönbrunn in Vienna, because it, again, is one of my favourite steamers. Unfortunately, it's not there. And Keppel in Grand Harbour at Malta, which is run by Hornblower Cruises. We'll leave that. I hope I haven't bored you too much. Thanks for allowing me, for the first time in 54 years, to indulge myself tonight and wallow in a bit of nostalgia. And I can only hope that I have heeded Teddy Roosevelt's advice and that my nostalgia is not unreflected and so has not led to too many bad monsters. Thank you.
Gordon, that was fabulous again. Thanks so much. And I now know two people who originated from Kilmarnock. Two men? No. There's Andrew. Gordon, thanks so much. It's suddenly got very cold in here, so I suggest that we call a halt to proceedings. But can I just say a final thank you to all three of our speakers. That was an absolute fabulous, such a contrast between the three speakers, which was most enjoyable. And thank you so much indeed for all the hard work that the three of you put in. Many thanks. It remains for me to wish you a very happy Christmas and a very merry New Year. And we'll see you in January. Thank you very much indeed.